everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be comparing cheap and expensive watercolor paper and explaining why I think this is one of the most important decisions to make as a watercolor artist. First up, I have this Kmart brand watercolor paper, which was only a few dollars at my local Kmart. Next up, we have this Fabriano Artistico Aquarello watercolor paper. The Anchor one from Kmart was $3 total, and the Fabriano one was $46.50 total. Now that is a massive price difference. Not only that, but the Kmart one actually has 24 sheets, whereas the Fabriano only has 12 sheets. Now comparing them side by side, I can already see a very big contrast and difference with how these look. And I'm going to let you guess what I'm going to mention first. Have you guessed it? As you can see, the cheap one isn't even a proper white. It's sort of like a grayish off-white color, whereas the expensive one is a very bright white color. Something like that is actually very important because watercolors are traditionally a transparent medium, so you need a really bright surface to paint on so that your colors are going to look really nice. So the first test I'm going to make is I am going to do a nice flat wash here, and I'm going to add a lot of water because I want to see how this paper takes the water and how a flat wash is going to look once dry. When you do this, you want to see the paper stay flat and not buckle up, because when that happens, you're going to encounter some issues. As you can see here, the paint is actually pooling in the middle, and it's actually pooling in an area where the paper is dipping in because it's sort of wrinkling. Now I did add a lot of water, and eventually all papers are going to do this, but with the higher quality paper you can see that the results are far more even, and the cheaper paper, it's not even completely dry yet because it ended up pooling all the water in the middle, and then the sides are like drying while there's this river still going through the middle of the wash. I can already tell that large flat washes on the cheaper paper is definitely going to be a very bad idea. Next, I'm just going to see how the paper does with a little bit less water and a bit more paint, as you can see here. And it doesn't look too bad when it is less wet and you're using like a thicker concentration of paint versus water. But I can still see a slight difference. As you can see on the lower quality paper, there's a very slight darker outline around the paint, and that is basically because the paint is moving from where I put it, and it's sort of drying around the edge in a more concentrated way. Next, I'm going to test a wet on wet method, which is where I put down some water, and the water's a bit stained with yellow paint, but that doesn't matter too much because I'm testing out how the paint sort of spreads on this wet surface, and especially how it dries as well. You do want to see the paint sort of spread and mingle a little bit with this technique, but what you don't want to see is the paint deviating from where you put it and ended up pooling in sections around the outside, and then having the middle sort of blurred and, I don't know, just paint not staying where you want it to go. So here it is before it dries, and I'm going to show you what it looks like after it's dry, and this is exactly what I was talking about, as you can see. Also, you can see how the first flat wash finally dried, and this actually surprised me. The paint in the middle that took the longest to dry, it's separated into like reds and yellows, and I tried to do like a flat wash with a lot of water, and you don't want to see like mixtures of like reds and yellows when you make an orange, especially since I didn't even mix different paint colors. This was like a proper orange just from the paint, and it's already separated. And as you can see, they're completely different as well with the wet on wet blending. Another thing I want to mention is the strength of the paper as well. This cheaper paper, it's so much easier to just rip, whereas the expensive $46 paper is much harder to rip. And that's because of one thing in particular, and that is the fact that the highest quality watercolor papers are made with 100% cotton, whereas, you know, the more cheaper papers are actually made with paper or wood pulp. So that's enough of the stress tests. Let's actually make an artwork on both of these papers and make a very, very similar artwork with all of the same steps, because I want to see how far these differences go, and I actually want to try to make a good artwork on the cheap paper and see how close I can get them to be, because you can actually make good artwork on more affordable watercolor paper. What's going to change though is the difficulty, because I'm actually not against using affordable art supplies. I use them all the time. I own Copic markers, but a lot of the time I will use the cheaper markers. But with watercolors specifically, I actually find that the paper is actually more important than the paints are most of the time. If you're a starting artist and you don't have a whole lot of money to spend on art supplies, I honestly think you should invest more in the paper than you do in the paints. You can actually have the most fanciest watercolors in the world, and if you put them on the wrong paper, it's going to be so much more difficult to paint versus having, say, student grade watercolors, but really nice cotton watercolor paper. I hope that made sense. I hope that I explained that properly. So let's talk a little bit about the painting process. Now, I actually ended up sketching some nice little characters on here. As you can see, I decided on a pumpkin dragon just because I thought that would be cute, and with Halloween sort of close, I just got a little bit excited and I wanted to make a pumpkin dragon because I just thought it was a really cute idea. Now, before I actually went in and painted, I ended up lightening up that sketch and then going over with some colored pencils just to have a little bit more refined line art. And when using pencils on both of these papers, I could definitely feel the difference. I could feel that if I was too rough or hard with the colored pencils, and if the pencil was a little bit too sharp, I could definitely damage or, you know, scratch through the paper because it's just not as strong and dense as the cotton one. And with the cotton one, it was really, really strong, so I felt like I could push down hard on that page and I wasn't going to like scratch or damage the paper at all. I'm very heavy-handed when I draw, so sometimes I have to worry about that. Now, first off, you can see that the colors on the more expensive paper do look brighter and more vibrant, especially when they dry as well. So one thing that I actually noticed was when the paint was drying on the cheaper paper, it sort of moved around more than the other one. So when I tried to make some wet blends for shadows, they ended up more washed out, and I sort of had to layer over the top of them more just so that I could get those shadows where I wanted them to be. Oftentimes, once the paint dried, it looked different to it did when it was wet, so I had to sort of rework it a few times to sort of push it in the direction where I wanted it to be. I also noticed that the drying time on the cheaper paper was actually longer than the drying time on the good paper. And one thing you can actually already see is that the highlights on the good paper are much brighter than the highlights on the cheaper paper, and that's mainly because, as you can see, the paper isn't properly like white. It's like a darkish grayish off-white color, and that's a problem with watercolor paper as well, because the white of the paper is basically your highlights. You need to preserve those highlights, so without proper white paper, you're not going to end up with the highlights that you want and the contrast that you planned for. I found when trying to add flat washes, there was a lot more texture where I didn't want texture. Now, texture isn't inherently a bad thing at all. A lot of the time I will purposefully add texture, but that's the thing though. When you're painting and texture ends up being where you don't want it to be, that's a bad thing. It has to be something that's intentional. Now, I feel like I'm bashing this paper a little bit too much. It is definitely possible to make good art on cheaper watercolor paper, but you're going to end up fighting it a lot more. And I've done this myself. My first few watercolor paintings were actually on cheaper watercolor paper because I made the mistake of spending less on the paper. And I feel like that was a mistake because I honestly felt like I wasn't that great at painting. I struggled a lot and I would end up painting like a texture or a layer down, and I felt like I had to fight with the paint to get it to do what I wanted. And that actually deterred me a little bit from using watercolor paints, and I don't want anyone else to feel like that. So my advice is definitely invest more in the paper, especially if you're starting out. There is a lot of options out there for watercolor paper. You don't have to spend a whole lot but it's definitely best to find something that is 100% cotton and the highest weight that you can afford. It's going to help you so much in the long run, more so than buying high quality artist grade watercolor paints. I'm putting this out there because I wish someone else told me this when I started out, because it would have saved me a lot of struggling. I am happy with both of these artworks though. I think that the creature turned out really cute, and I did make a good artwork on both. Now we just have to peel off that tape off the outer edges, and as you can see here, the tape is actually damaging the cheaper paper, but it doesn't even phase the cotton paper one bit. So anyways, I hope this video was insightful for you guys, and I hope I helped someone. Here is the final results, and I honestly love these guys so much. They are so cute, and it was definitely a lot of fun playing with watercolors again. I have missed it, honestly. Hope you're all having a lovely day. Please stay safe, and I shall see you in my next video. Bye everyone.